I watched my son-in-law throw my daughter's suede travel bag into an industrial trash compactor. I did not think twice. I did not weigh the consequences. I did not consider my bad knee or the fact that I am not 25 anymore. I ran. I ran toward that dumpster like a man half my age, and I ripped that bag out of the machine's mouth seconds before the crushing blades would have turned it and everything inside it into scrap. I thought of my daughter. I thought of her face, and I held that bag against my chest like it was her, and I drove home without looking back once in the mirror. When I laid it down on my workbench in the garage, my fingers brushed against something wrong. Something hard, something rigid, buried deep in the lining at the bottom of the bag, sewn in tight, sewn in deliberate. A cold, ugly curiosity crawled up my spine, the kind I hadn't felt since my last year on the force. I reached for the box cutter on the shelf. My hands that used to be steady enough to hold a service weapon on a scared kid without flinching, were shaking as I cut along the seam, thread by thread. And when I saw what had been hidden inside my dead daughter's bag, I understood completely and instantly that nothing about my life was ever going to be the same again. Because what I was holding was not a keepsake. It was not some sentimental scrap her husband forgot to remove. It was evidence. It was a confession. It was the truth about how my daughter really died, sewn into leather by the very man who buried her. Before I tell you what I found hidden inside that bag, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where in this country you're watching from tonight. Because where I'm from, we don't let men like this one walk free, and by the end of this story, neither will you. My name is Lowell Draper. I'm 69 years old. I spent 31 years on the force before my knees gave out on me, and I have buried a wife and a daughter in the same 12-year stretch of my life. If you're expecting me to tell you I'm a bitter old man, save your breath. I earned every ounce of the bitterness I carry. I just don't let it drive the car. I want to tell you about the first time I met Rourke Chandler, because it matters. It matters because everything that came after, the fire, the funeral, the 2 years of being handed my own grandson in 15-minute increments like a man on supervised visitation with his own blood, all of it started with a handshake in my daughter's living room that I should have never let go on so long. He was 34. He wore a watch that cost more than my first house and cologne that filled a room before he did. He worked in wealth management, some outfit downtown called Blackwell Ridge Capital, and he had the kind of smile that never quite made it up to his eyes, the kind I used to see on con men in interrogation rooms right before they asked for a lawyer. I was a cop for 3 decades. I know a performance when I see one, but Sylvie, my daughter, my only child, looked at that man like he'd hung the moon. And what is a father supposed to do with that? You don't get to tell a grown woman who to love. You just get to stand there in your ill-fitting suit at her wedding and hope to God you're wrong about the man she picked. I was wrong about being wrong. I was right the whole time. Rourke played the part of the devoted husband and the doting father to my grandson Finn beautifully. I'll give him that much, the way you'd give a magician credit for a card trick even after you've figured out the mechanism. After the fire took Sylvie 2 years ago, after that house on Birchwood Lane went up in the middle of the night while Finn was, thank God, at a sleepover, Rourke went on the local news and cried real tears for the cameras. He started a foundation in her name, the Sylvie Chandler Memorial Fund, if you can stomach the irony of it. And for a while, this city treated him like a saint who'd lost his wings too soon. Grieving widower, single father, local hero rebuilding his life for the sake of his little boy. And me, I got quieter and quieter in the story. First it was, give him space, Lowell, he's grieving. Then it was, Finn has therapy on Saturdays now, maybe next month. Then it was voicemail after voicemail that never got returned. Birthdays where I dropped off a present at the door because I wasn't invited past it. I am a man who spent 3 decades reading liars for a living, and I sat on my hands and let this one push me out of my own grandson's life an inch at a time, because I was terrified that if I pushed back too hard, A judge somewhere would decide a bitter old ex-cop wasn't a fit influence, and I would lose the only piece of my daughter I had left. So I swallowed it. Every single time. Which brings me to that Tuesday afternoon. 2 years to the week since we buried Sylvie. It was the anniversary, and I'd bought Finn a model fire truck. He's 5 now, obsessed with trucks the way boys that age always are. And I drove out to the house to drop it off, because it was the one day of the year I knew I could show up without an appointment and not be turned away at the door. I parked across the street, the way I always did, out of some old habit of watching a location before I approached it. And that's when I saw him. Rourke, in the side yard by the garage, dragging a black trash bag toward the industrial dumpster the property management company had left out for a remodel. Nothing strange about a man taking out the trash, except I watched him stop, reach into that bag and pull something out separately, a bag within the bag. Sylvie's mustard yellow suede travel bag, the one she'd carried on every trip since college, the one I'd watched her pack 100 times for weekend getaways, the one with the little brass buckle she used to jingle when she was nervous. He didn't set it down gently. He didn't hesitate, the way you hesitate when you're finally letting go of something that belonged to someone you loved. He hurled it, both hands, full extension, like he was trying to put it somewhere it could never crawl back out of. It landed against the compactor's intake with a dull, ugly thud, and for 1/2 of 1 second before the machine's hydraulics groaned to life, I saw his face. There are 2 kinds of faces you learn to tell apart in 31 years of police work. There's the face of a man getting rid of grief, and there's the face of a man getting rid of a problem. Rourke's face, in that half-second, had nothing soft in it at all. No sorrow, no nostalgia, just a flat, hard, hurried kind of contempt, the look of a man scraping something off the bottom of his shoe. The old instincts I thought had retired along with my badge sat straight up inside my chest. I was out of my car and across that street before I'd consciously decided to move. I didn't think about my knee. I didn't think about the fact that I am, by every technical definition, an old man. I thought about Sylvie's face on that bag's brass buckle, and I ran and I got my hand around the strap and yanked it free of the compactor's mouth with maybe 2 seconds to spare before the crushing arm would have turned it to pulp. Rourke didn't even come after me. He just stood there, arms crossed, watching me clutch his dead wife's travel bag like a lunatic, and he said in that smooth, unbothered voice of his, "Take it if it means that much to you, Lowell. It's just an old bag." Then he turned around and walked back inside without another word, without asking why a 69-year-old man had just sprinted across a residential street. That should have told me everything right there. A grieving husband fights you for the last piece of his wife. A guilty man just lets you walk away with the evidence, because he doesn't think you're smart enough to know what you're holding. I drove home with that bag in my passenger seat like it was a live thing. I set it on my workbench in the garage, under the hanging shop light, and I ran my hands over every inch of it, the way you'd examine a body at a scene, out of some muscle memory I didn't know I still had. And that's when my fingers found it. A hard rectangular shape, buried in the insulated lining at the bottom, stitched shut with thread that didn't quite match the leather if you looked close enough, which I did, because looking close is the only skill this job ever really gave me. I got my box cutter, I cut the seam, and a small solid-state drive, wrapped tight in an anti-static bag, dropped into my open palm. It hadn't burned in the fire, because it had never been in the fire. It had been in this bag, hidden, protected, insulated, driven around in the trunk of a Porsche for 2 years, while a killer waited for the right moment to make it disappear for good. My hands weren't steady. I plugged the drive into an old laptop dock I kept in a drawer, and a password prompt blinked up at me, patient and cold. I thought about every arrogant thing I'd watched that man do in the last 2 years. The way he'd looked at me over Sylvie's casket like I was an inconvenience at his own performance. The way, exactly 7 days after the insurance settlement cleared, he'd pulled into my driveway in a brand new Porsche 911, black on black, and let the engine idle a little too long so I'd be sure to hear it. I typed the plate number into that password field with 2 shaking fingers. The screen unlocked, and somewhere in my chest, under 3 decades of learned restraint, something old and dangerous woke back up. I want you to understand something about what I found on that drive, because it wasn't what I expected, and it was somehow so much worse than anything I'd imagined driving home from that garage. I braced myself for photographs. I braced myself for some sick trophy video, some drunken confession filmed at 3 in the morning that a smarter man would have destroyed years ago. That's what killers do in the movies I used to watch after a long shift, back when I still believed the job ended when I clocked out. That is not what Rourke Chandler did, and the difference matters more than you might think. What I found were folders. Organized, labeled, color-coded, dated by quarter like a man tracking earnings. The kind of meticulous filing system you'd expect from 31 years of catching men who thought they were smarter than the paper trail they left behind. Spreadsheets. Offshore bank statements from 3 different jurisdictions. A handwritten notebook in a tight, controlled, almost elegant script, logging chemical dosages and reaction windows like a lab technician tracking a clinical trial. There was no confession here, in the way I understood the word from 3 decades of interrogation rooms. There was something colder, something that scared me more than a confession ever could. There was a record. A ledger of a man's decision, kept the way you'd keep receipts for a tax audit, because somewhere in that beautiful, empty head of his, Rourke Chandler didn't believe what he'd done was a crime at all. He believed it was a portfolio, and he was proud of the returns. The first folder was named simply Baseline. I opened it, and the air went out of my garage like someone had cracked a window in the middle of a snowstorm. Inside was a scanned copy of my late wife's death certificate. Margaret, 10 years dead now, of what every doctor in this city told me, gently, with practiced sympathy, was a sudden and catastrophic cardiac event. A tragedy, they called it. An act of God, my pastor said at the funeral, standing over a casket I chose myself, in a suit I still can't wear without my hands going cold. I'd grieved her for a decade believing that phrase. Act of God. And there it was on my laptop screen, that same death certificate, circled in red digital ink, with 2 typed words beneath it that I will hear in my own head until the day I follow her into the ground. First test. I made myself keep reading, because a lifetime of police work teaches you one hard, ugly lesson above all others. Stopping halfway through evidence is how good men let monsters walk free to do it again. There was a scanned receipt, black market, itemized like a grocery list, for potassium chloride, dated 11 days before Margaret's heart stopped beating in our bed while I slept beside her. There were notes attached, clinical, detached, almost proud of their own precision, describing how he had gained access to our home during a family visit, how he had substituted a compound into Margaret's heart medication timed to trigger a fatal arrhythmia that would read as natural on any standard toxicology screen. He called it, in his own cold handwriting, a controlled variable. He hadn't been testing whether he could get away with murder. He already knew, somewhere in that calculating skull of his, that he could. He was testing whether he could do it clean enough that no one, not even a house full of retired cops who loved her, would ever think to ask the question in the first place. My wife, the woman I built a life with for 38 years, the woman who used to leave the porch light on for me on night shifts, reduced to a line item in a killer's proof of concept, a footnote in his own private research and development. I sat on the concrete floor of my garage for I don't know how long. When I finally stood back up, my hands weren't shaking anymore. They'd gone past shaking into something stiller and far more dangerous. I opened the next folder. It was labeled simply Sylvie. Inside was a scanned document, creased and worn soft at the folds, the way paper gets when it's been carried around and unfolded 100 anxious times before it ever reached that drive, a DNA paternity test dated 4 months before the fire. I read it twice before the words assembled themselves into a sentence my brain could accept. The test confirmed with a probability rounded to the 4th decimal point that Rourke Chandler was not, and could never biologically have been, the father of my grandson Finn. I want to be honest with you about what went through my mind in that moment, because I think you deserve the same unfiltered truth I had to sit alone with on that cold floor. My first thought wasn't about Rourke at all. It was about my daughter, and the desperate, quiet, brave hope she must have carried by herself for years. Because the notes attached to that file filled in the rest of the picture. Rourke was infertile. Completely. Medically. Permanently. A fact confirmed by his own private urologist's letterhead sitting right there in the folder. And he had lied to Sylvie about it for years, feeding her fabricated stories about treatment and specialists and just a little more time. Because admitting the truth meant admitting to the golden boy of Blackwell Ridge Capital that he couldn't give his wife the one thing on this earth she wanted more than his money, his watch, or his cologne. My daughter wanted to be a mother so badly that she went, quietly, on her own, to a fertility clinic 2 states over, and she made that decision alone, in secret, carrying the full weight of it by herself. Because some part of her already didn't trust the man she'd married with something that precious. Finn wasn't the product of some affair, some betrayal on her part, whatever a defense attorney might one day try to imply in a courtroom. He was the product of a woman who refused to let her husband's lies stand between her and the one thing she wanted most in this world. That is not shame. That is the single bravest thing I have ever learned about my own daughter, and I had to learn it from inside a killer's evidence file. But Rourke didn't see any of that. Rourke, a man who priced everything he touched, saw a liability walking around his house calling him Dad. The final document in that folder was a printed email thread forwarded from Sylvie's private account between her and a family law attorney 3 towns over, dated barely a month before she died. In it she laid out everything, methodically, like the sharp, careful woman I raised her to be. The black accounts Rourke thought she'd never find, funneled through shell entities tied to Blackwell Ridge Capital, money he was quietly skimming off client portfolios and hiding from both the SEC and his own wife. She'd found it. She'd printed the statements herself and hidden copies where he'd never think to look. She was 3 weeks from filing for divorce, and in that email she was specific, brutally specific, about her intentions. Full custody of Finn, a forensic accounting subpoena aimed at his firm, and, this was the line Rourke had underlined in red ink, twice, hard enough to tear the paper, the DNA test attached as a formal exhibit, permanently and legally severing any parental claim he might try to make on a son who had never been his blood to begin with. Rourke Chandler wasn't about to lose a wife that spring. He was about to lose everything he had built his entire identity on top of. The money, the house on Birchwood Lane, the image of the devoted young husband every neighbor envied, and the boy above all else, the boy he needed more than any of it. To keep playing the role of the perfect grieving father this city would go on to adore for 2 more years running. So he burned the house down around her while she slept upstairs, and he built himself a clean alibi standing 3 states away at a finance conference, shaking hands and laughing at cocktail hour while smoke filled his own bedroom. And he let the fire department rule it faulty wiring, and he let this city hand him a medal and a foundation and a standing ovation for surviving a tragedy he had personally architected down to the ignition point. I sat there in my garage, with my daughter's blood pressure spiking in my own veins, and I understood, with a clarity that frightened me more than anything else that whole long night, that I was no longer looking at a grieving son-in-law who'd made me uncomfortable at Thanksgiving dinners. I was looking at the man who had murdered both women I loved most in this world, and then dressed himself in their morning clothes to profit from it, in front of an entire city that applauded him for it. I closed the laptop. I sat in the dark of my garage for a long time, listening to nothing but my own breathing and the hum of the refrigerator in the corner, and I made myself a promise I intend to keep for whatever years I have left on this earth. Rourke Chandler was going to learn, in slow and excruciating detail, exactly what it feels like to be hunted by someone who used to do it for a living and never once forgot how. Here's something they don't teach you in the academy, but you learn it fast on the street, and you never forget it for the rest of your life. The truth doesn't matter half as much as what you can prove, and what you can prove doesn't matter at all if the way you got it can be torn apart by a decent attorney in under 10 minutes flat. I sat with that drive for 2 full days before I let myself even touch it again, because the cop in me, the part of me that spent 3 decades building cases instead of tearing them apart, knew exactly what I was holding and exactly how useless it was in its current form. If I walked into the 3rd Precinct tomorrow morning and dropped a solid-state drive on Chief Roy Osei's desk, a drive I'd pulled out of a dumpster bag that technically belonged to my own son-in-law, any lawyer worth his retainer would stand up in front of a judge and paint a picture I could already see forming word for word in my head. Bitter, grieving father-in-law. Documented custody friction going back 2 years. A drive with no verified chain of custody, no forensic imaging done by anyone with a badge, no proof it hadn't been planted, edited, or fabricated by a man with a cop's technical know-how, and a grudge he'd been nursing since the funeral. Rourke's attorneys wouldn't even need to disprove a word of what was on that drive. They'd only need to make 12 strangers in a jury box doubt where it came from. And I had personally watched better, cleaner cases than this one collapse on exactly that hinge, back when I was the one presenting them. I needed something that couldn't be argued with. I needed physical evidence, sitting somewhere Rourke didn't know I could reach, discovered the right way, by the right people, in a manner that would hold up in front of the coldest defense attorney money could buy. So I called Emery Vale. Emery and I go back to my 2nd year on the job, back when he was running the department's fledgling digital forensics unit out of a windowless room nobody else wanted, teaching a bunch of beat cops who thought the cloud was weather how to pull deleted files off a hard drive 1 sector at a time. He retired 8 years before I did, sick to death of budget cuts and younger supervisors who didn't know a packet sniffer from a fishing lure, and he lives now in a converted machine shop out past the city limits, surrounded by more monitors than a NASA control room and exactly 0 patience for small talk from anyone, including me. I trusted that man with my life more than once on this job, back when trusting the wrong person got you shot instead of merely sued. I drove out there with the drive wrapped in a dish towel like it was something holy, and I told him everything, start to finish, without leaving out a single detail. Emery didn't say much while I talked. He just listened the way he always had, with that flat, unreadable face he used to wear across the table from suspects twice his size, and when I finally finished, he held out his hand without a word, and I gave him the drive like I was handing over a live grenade. It took him 4 days. 4 days I spent pacing the rooms of my own house, jumping at every car that slowed on my street, checking the locks twice before bed, like habits I thought I'd retired along with my badge. When he finally called, his voice had none of its usual dry humor left in it at all. "Lowell," he said, flat and careful, "you need to sit down for this one." He'd found everything I'd found, the ledger, the notebooks, the DNA test. But Emery, God bless his meticulous soul, had gone further than I would have ever thought to on my own. He'd traced a series of quarterly wire transfers, buried 3 shell accounts deep, disguised as consulting fees, landing every 3 months in the personal account of a man named Grover Pike. It took me a second to place that name, and then it hit me cold. Grover Pike was the fire inspector who'd signed the official report ruling Sylvie's fire an accident, faulty wiring, case closed, no further investigation warranted. $12,000, 4 times a year, 2 years running, dressed up neatly on paper as payment for electrical consulting services. A fire inspector had absolutely no legitimate reason to be providing a wealth manager who didn't own a single rental property. And there was more waiting for me. Emery had also found a storage facility lease 20 minutes outside the city, signed 18 months earlier under a name that wasn't Rourke's at all. A man calling himself Dexter Boone, paying in cash every month for a climate-controlled unit at a facility that didn't ask too many questions as long as the rent cleared on time. The signature on that lease, Emery told me, comparing it pixel by pixel on his monitor, matched a handwriting sample buried in one of the ledger's scanned notebook pages down to the exact tilt of the capital R. Rourke had a second location, somewhere private, somewhere separate from everything else, somewhere he kept things he didn't trust, even to a hidden hard drive sewn into a dead woman's travel bag. We had the where. What we didn't have was a legal how. No judge on this earth grants a search warrant on a hunch and a stolen drive with a shaky chain of custody. I needed a physical way into that unit, obtained in a manner that had nothing to do with the evidence I already possessed, something clean enough that when Chief Osei's people eventually arrived with a real, properly signed warrant, none of it would trace back to a break-in an old man committed out of grief and rage, which meant I needed to get close to Rourke again. Closer than he'd allowed me in 2 long years of being handed my own grandson in careful, rationed doses. I hated what I decided to do next, and given the same choice today, I'd do it again without a moment's hesitation. I put on the oldest, most worn-out flannel shirt I owned, the one with the frayed cuffs my late wife used to threaten to throw in the trash every winter. I didn't shave. I drove to Rourke's house the following Sunday, and I rang the doorbell, with my shoulders hunched and my voice deliberately cracking, playing the part of a lonely, defeated old man finally worn down enough to come crawling to his son-in-law's door, apologizing for being difficult, begging for nothing more than an hour with his grandson. It cost me something real, standing on that porch performing weakness in front of a man who had murdered my wife and my daughter in cold, calculated silence. Every instinct still left in my body wanted to put my hands around his throat instead of my hat in mine. But I had learned a long time ago, across hundreds of interrogation rooms, that the best confessions never come from the men you push. They come from the men who believe they've already won. Rourke ate it up whole. I watched something smug and satisfied settle into his handsome, empty face as he stepped aside and waved me in, the exact look a cat wears watching something smaller limp across an open floor. "Of course, Lowell," he said, all warm condescension dripping off every syllable. "Family's family, after all." He set his wallet down carelessly on the kitchen island while he went upstairs to fetch Finn, exactly the way he did on every single visit, creature of habit that he was, always trusting his own house completely, never once suspecting the pathetic, broken old man sitting quietly on his living room couch. I had less than 90 seconds. Emery had given me a small keycard cloning device no bigger than a matchbook, and while Finn's small feet thundered down the staircase above me, I slid Rourke's cloned keycard out of his wallet, ran it once across the reader, and slipped it back into place, angle and all, before his son ever hit the bottom step. Finn ran into my arms a moment later, and for those few precious minutes, holding my grandson tight, while his father hovered nearby congratulating himself on his own generosity, I let myself feel something close to peace for the first time in 2 years. Because I finally had what I needed. And Rourke Chandler, standing there in his own kitchen, sipping expensive imported coffee, had absolutely no idea he had just handed a lifelong investigator the key to his own downfall. Emery and I broke into that storage facility at 1 a.m. on a Wednesday, because Wednesdays, according to Emery, are when a place like that runs its thinnest security rotation, a fact he knew from 3 separate contracts he'd worked back in his consulting years after retirement, back when he was still teaching security firms how thieves like us think. The facility sat on the edge of an industrial stretch outside the city, half its units sitting empty behind chain link, sodium lights buzzing overhead in that sick amber color that makes every man look like a corpse walking. My heart hadn't pounded like that since my last active foot pursuit 15 years and one blown-out knee ago, and I felt every one of my 69 years in my chest that night. We walked the row of units in silence, counting numbers under our breath like a couple of burglars half our age until we reached Unit 114. I held the cloned keycard against the reader with a hand that wasn't quite steady, and for one long, unbearable second, nothing happened at all, and I genuinely thought the entire plan had collapsed right there in the dark, that Rourke had already changed his access codes, that we were about to be caught on some camera we hadn't accounted for. Then the little light blinked green, and the lock disengaged with a soft, mechanical click that sounded, to my rattled nerves, louder than a gunshot fired point blank. Inside, the unit itself was almost disappointingly ordinary at first glance. No cash stacked in bricks, no drugs, no weapons, nothing you'd expect from a television crime drama. Just a few pieces of furniture nobody in the world would ever miss, a rolled-up rug leaning against one wall and half hidden behind a stack of unmarked moving boxes shoved into the back corner, a wall safe. Not the flimsy kind you buy off a shelf at a hardware store for $200. A real one drilled and bolted directly into the cinder block behind it, the kind of safe a man installs when he genuinely, deeply believes no living soul will ever think to come looking for it. Emery knelt in front of it with a small electronic device I didn't recognize, some contraption he had clearly built or modified himself over years of tinkering, and went to work without offering a single word of explanation, the way he always did when he was concentrating. 20 long minutes passed in that dead, suffocating silence, broken only by his steady breathing and the occasional soft electronic beep from his equipment. And then, with a heavy mechanical clunk that echoed off the concrete walls, the safe's door finally swung open. Inside was a single black velvet box, the kind you'd expect to hold an engagement ring, sitting alone and centered on an otherwise completely empty shelf, like it had been placed there with something close to ceremony. I lifted the lid myself, my breath catching somewhere behind my ribs, and I understood, in the space of a single heartbeat, that I wasn't looking at a simple hiding place anymore. I was looking at a trophy case, curated with the same obsessive precision as everything else that man had ever touched. The first thing I saw was a ring, a wedding band, delicate gold, set with a burnt orange stone I would have recognized anywhere on this earth, because I was the one who had stood beside Sylvie and helped her pick that exact ring out of a jewelry case 11 years earlier, back when she still let her old man tag along on the important errands of her life. Rourke had told the fire investigators on the record, under oath, in front of cameras, that this ring had been on Sylvie's hand the night the fire took her, that it had melted down to nothing in the extreme heat along with the rest of her jewelry, a tragic little detail the local news had repeated for months as proof of just how devastating and total that night had truly been. That ring was sitting, whole and untouched, in a velvet box, in a storage unit rented under a stranger's fake name 20 minutes from the ashes of the house where it was supposedly destroyed. Beneath it, wrapped separately in a small square of tissue paper, was a silver cross pendant on a broken chain. I recognized it instantly, and something in my chest went cold and hollow in a way even Margaret's death certificate hadn't managed to accomplish. It was my wife's, the cross she wore every single day of our 38 years together, the one that had simply vanished, we all assumed at the time, sometime around her funeral, lost somewhere, in the chaos of grief and casseroles and well-meaning relatives moving through our house. It hadn't been lost at all. It had been taken, deliberately kept, catalogued carefully right alongside my daughter's ring, in a private collection assembled over a decade by the same man who had murdered them both, 10 years apart, and called each death a controlled variable. There was more beneath that layer still. 2 additional small mementos, a delicate hair clip, a thin gold bracelet, each wrapped with that same obsessive, almost reverent care, each accompanied by a folded, yellowing document I recognized before I'd even finished unfolding the paper. Life insurance policies. 2 more names I had never once heard before that night. 2 more women from 2 entirely different cities, each one having died of sudden, unremarkable, tragically ordinary accidents, years before Rourke Chandler ever set foot in our city and met my daughter at a charity gala. Neither one of us had particularly wanted to attend that night. I understood then, standing in that cold storage unit at 1 in the morning with a velvet box shaking in my hands, exactly what kind of man I had let marry my daughter without ever asking the hard questions a father should have asked. This wasn't a man who had snapped once, in a single moment of financial desperation. This was a predator with a repeatable pattern, a collector with a working system, a man who married wealthy, trusting women, engineered their perfect accidental deaths one by one, cashed the insurance, kept a private souvenir of each conquest, and then quietly packed up and moved on to build the exact same beautiful, poisonous life somewhere new. My daughter hadn't been some isolated tragedy this city mourned for a season. She had simply been the next stop on a route he'd been running, patiently and profitably, for years. Every instinct left in my body screamed at me to smash that box's contents against the concrete floor, to burn the entire unit down myself and stand there watching it go, the exact same way he'd watched Sylvie's house burn from 3 states away over a hotel phone call. But 31 years of police work had taught me something more valuable than rage in that exact moment, and that something was discipline. I did not touch a single item inside that box with my bare hands. I photographed every angle, every visible surface, every serial number stamped on every insurance document, methodically, the same way I'd been trained decades earlier to preserve a scene before anyone else could contaminate it beyond use. Rourke's fingerprints were almost certainly all over that safe, that box, every item inside it. Mine could not be anywhere near a single one of them, or every photograph I was taking right then would be worth exactly nothing in front of a judge. When I finished, I stepped back out into the cold night air, and I called the one man left in this city I trusted completely with what I now knew. Chief Roy Osai, my old partner from back when we were both young enough to still believe this job would somehow get easier with time. He answered on the second ring, groggy and annoyed at the hour, right up until I said 4 words that changed the entire tone of that call in an instant. "Roy, I found hell!" There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. Then, in that steady, focused voice I remembered from 100 crime scenes we'd worked side by side, he said, "Don't touch anything else. Don't say another word about this on an open line. I'm calling it in properly, and I'm handling it myself, personally, start to finish." For the first time in 2 long years, I felt something loosen in my chest that had been wound tight as a fist since the night of that fire. Justice, real justice, the kind that holds up under cross-examination instead of collapsing the moment a good lawyer leans on it, was finally, carefully, and irreversibly being set into motion. Chief Roy Osai moved faster and cleaner than I could have hoped for, and I want you to understand exactly what that meant, because it mattered more than anything else in this entire story. Within 18 hours of my call, Roy had a properly sworn warrant built on an anonymous tip that led investigators to that storage unit through channels solid enough to survive any cross-examination a defense attorney could throw at them for the rest of his career. Emery's digital footprint was scrubbed clean before the sun came up the next morning. My name appeared on exactly 0 pieces of paperwork, anywhere, ever. The entire operation was constructed, brick by careful brick, the same disciplined way I used to build cases myself 30 years earlier, back when doing it right mattered more to me than doing it fast. By the following morning, a tactical team was standing in the marble lobby of Blackwell Ridge Capital, and Rourke Chandler, wealth manager of the year 2 years running, celebrated local philanthropist, grieving widower turned devoted single father, was walked out of his own glass corner office in handcuffs while his entire trading floor rose from their desks in silence to watch it happen in real time. Somebody's phone caught the whole thing on video before security even thought to intervene, and by that evening it had already been picked up and replayed by every local news outlet in the state, then the region, then, within a week, the country. The image he had spent 2 patient years constructing, piece by careful piece, brick by charitable donation, collapsed in the space of a single afternoon. I'll admit to you now, without 1 ounce of shame or apology, that I felt something close to pure joy watching that footage loop over and over on my kitchen television, the same kitchen counter where he used to set his wallet down like he owned every room he ever walked into, mine included, uninvited. Finn was placed with me that same day. Emergency temporary custody, arranged with a speed I strongly suspect Roy personally leaned on every available lever in this city to secure on my behalf. And when the social worker walked my grandson up my own front porch steps that evening, 5 years old, and clutching a stuffed dinosaur, utterly bewildered by a day far too enormous for a boy his age to understand or ever fully forget, I knelt down right there on that porch, held him against my chest, and made him a quiet promise I intended to spend the rest of my natural life keeping, no matter what it cost me. Grover Pike, the fire inspector who had quietly cashed $48,000 over 2 years to sign his name to a lie, folded almost immediately once investigators laid his own bank records out in front of him on a table, page by page. Men who sell their integrity in small quarterly installments rarely have the spine left to defend the sale once the final invoice comes due, and within a week he was cooperating fully in exchange for a lighter sentence, handing prosecutors a signed statement that confirmed, in his own words, exactly what Rourke had paid him to overlook the night that house on Birchwood Lane went up in flames with my daughter asleep inside it. Rourke, predictably, lawyered up within the hour of his arrest, invoking his rights the moment detectives sat him down across an interrogation table, exactly the move you'd expect from a man who had spent his entire adult career professionally managing risk for other people's money and, it turned out, his own liberty. He sat there with his arms crossed, tie loosened just enough to look casually unbothered for the cameras that weren't even in the room, and told the 2 detectives across from him, in that same smug, unshaken voice I remembered too well from standing in his own kitchen, "If you don't have anything concrete, get my attorney on the phone. We're done talking until he's sitting in this room." Standard procedure, and he knew it cold, the way a man knows the exact rules of a game he spent years assuming he'd never actually have to play. The moment those words left his mouth, a formal interrogation had to legally stop dead in its tracks. But it wasn't a formal interrogation that opened that door 30 minutes later. It was me. Roy had cleared it in advance with the district attorney's office. Not an interview, not sworn testimony that would ever see the inside of a courtroom, just a family visit, permitted under the same standard rules that let any relative sit briefly with a man in custody before his attorney physically arrives on scene. Rourke's face, when that door finally swung open and he saw me standing there instead of his lawyer, told me everything I ever needed to know about how thoroughly he had underestimated the pathetic, broken old man who had been begging at his front door for an hour with his own grandson only 2 weeks earlier. I didn't raise my voice once, not for a single second. I didn't need to. 31 years of interrogation work teaches a man that the loudest voice in any room is almost always the weakest one in it, and I had spent a lifetime carefully learning how to sit perfectly, patiently still. I lowered myself into the chair across from him, And without a word, I opened the plain manila envelope I'd carried in under my arm and slid its contents across the table, one photograph at a time, letting each image land in front of him like its own separate, individual verdict, waiting in silence for it to register fully before I placed the next one down. The burnt orange ring, sitting exactly where we'd found it, in its velvet box. The silver cross on its broken chain. The DNA test, its top corner still faintly creased from years of secret folding and unfolding by a woman who never got the chance to use it. The wire transfers to Grover Pike, dated and stamped in black and white. The storage unit lease, signed in his own unmistakable handwriting under the borrowed name Dexter Boone. I watched every last ounce of color drain slowly, completely, out of Rourke Chandler's handsome, empty face. "You think you're smart, Rourke?" I said, quiet, level, the exact voice I used to reserve for the coldest men I ever sat across a table from in 31 years of doing this job for a living. "You hid that drive inside Sylvie's bag because you liked the feeling of total control. You liked knowing precisely where every one of your secrets was sitting at all times, tucked away, safe, invisible to everyone but you. But you forgot one thing every arrogant man like you eventually forgets. Sooner or later, one way or another, a stray dog can bite a man once and run off into the night, and maybe he even gets away with it. But a wolf who spent 31 years learning exactly how men like you think doesn't ever let go once he's caught the scent. And I caught yours the second you threw my daughter's bag into that compactor." I tapped the DNA test once, hard enough that the sound cracked through the silence of that small room like a gunshot going off. "How exactly is your attorney planning to explain this one away in front of 12 strangers in a jury box? You were never Finn's father, not for one single day of his short life. And every last dollar, every stolen ring, every carefully staged accident you're sitting on right now is about to belong to the courts and to the families you took it from instead of you." Something in him broke right there in front of me, quietly, without a single sound, the exact opposite of the theatrical grief he'd performed so beautifully for the local news cameras 2 years earlier. The arrogance didn't leave his face all at once either. It drained out of him slowly, the way water leaks from a cracked glass, slow at first, and then suddenly all at once, until what was left sitting across that table from me wasn't a predator any more at all. It was a small, cornered, ordinary man who had just understood with total and permanent clarity that a safe covered in his own fingerprints was already sitting logged into an evidence locker 2 floors beneath us, and that no attorney walking this earth was ever going to get him out of that building a free man again. He didn't say a single word to me before I left. He didn't need to. I stood up slowly, straightened my old flannel shirt one last time out of pure habit, and walked out of that room without once looking back, leaving him alone at last with the full, undeniable weight of everything he had spent 2 years so carefully hiding, finally laid bare across a cold metal table under fluorescent light. Grover Pike's testimony sealed the coffin before the trial ever officially began. Once the fire inspector flipped, laying out the entire bribery scheme in a signed affidavit that named dates, dollar amounts, and phone calls down to the minute, Rourke's attorneys knew exactly what kind of arithmetic they were suddenly working with. A safe covered in his own fingerprints, a DNA test with his own physician's signature attached to it, bank records tracing in a clean, unbroken line straight to a bribed public official who was now cooperating fully with the state. There is only so much a good lawyer can spin before the spinning itself starts to look, to any reasonable jury, exactly like a confession dressed up in a 3-piece suit. The trial lasted 11 days. I sat in that courtroom, every single one of them, in the front row, in a suit I hadn't worn since Sylvie's funeral, and I watched the prosecution lay out my daughter's murder, my wife's murder, and the murders of 2 women I had never met, in 2 other states, piece by methodical piece, the same disciplined way I used to lay out cases myself back when I still carried a badge. Rourke sat at the defense table in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly pension, and for 11 straight days he wore the same flat, unreadable expression, the one I'd learned years ago to recognize as the face of a man who genuinely believed, right up until the very end, that he was simply too intelligent to ever actually lose. The forensic accountant testified for 2 full days, walking the jury through the offshore accounts, the skimmed client portfolios, the pattern of dead wealthy women stretching back nearly a decade across state lines. A retired detective from another jurisdiction flew in to testify about the 2 other women in that trophy box, both of whom, it turned out, had died in accidents ruled closed, years before anyone thought to connect the dots to a man who hadn't even lived in their states at the time of his marriages, to them under names slightly different from his own. The pattern, laid end to end in front of that jury, stopped looking like coincidence somewhere around the 3rd dead woman and started looking exactly like what it was. The jury didn't need long to reach a verdict. 4 counts, first-degree murder, aggravated by financial motive, and premeditation so extensively documented in his own handwriting that the prosecutor called it, in her closing argument, a business plan written in blood, filed and organized the way other men file their taxes. 4 consecutive life sentences, no possibility of parole, ever for the remainder of his natural life on this earth. When the verdict came down, Rourke turned in his chair and looked directly at me across that courtroom. And for one brief, unguarded second, I saw something in his eyes that almost looked like hatred, almost looked like the first honest emotion he'd shown in 2 full years of performing for cameras. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked out of that courtroom without looking back once, the same way I'd walked out of that interrogation room months earlier. Because a man like Rourke Chandler feeds on being watched, on being seen, on mattering to whoever's looking at him. I decided right there in that hallway that he would never see me flinch again for the rest of his life behind bars, and he never has. Which brings me to the part of this story that matters more to me than the trial, more than the verdict, more than watching him get led out of that courtroom in shackles while reporters shouted questions he'd never answer. It brings me to the work of actually raising my grandson. Finn is 8 years old now, 3 years into living under my roof full-time, and I've had to make a decision every single day since that first bewildered night on my porch about how much truth a growing boy can carry, and exactly when he's ready to carry it. I want to tell you something about the way I choose to do things, something I've come to believe with my whole chest, even though it isn't fashionable in every corner of this world anymore. I do not believe in raising children on comfortable fairy tales. I do not believe in letting a boy grow up quietly, wondering, somewhere in the back of his own mind, why his father is gone, and why every adult around him keeps changing the subject whenever he asks. Children are stronger than we give them credit for in this country, and the lies we tell to supposedly protect them almost always end up costing them far more. Later, once they find the truth on their own, than the truth ever would have cost them up front. So on the 3rd anniversary of Sylvie's death, I took Finn out to her grave, just the 2 of us, on a cool October afternoon, with the leaves already starting to turn gold along the fence line, and I told him the truth. All of it, translated into language an 8-year-old could hold on to without shattering under the full weight of it. I told him that the man everyone used to call his father had done something unforgivable, that he had hurt his mother badly, that he was in prison now, in a place he was never coming home from as long as he lived, and that this was exactly, precisely where he belonged. I watched Finn's face carefully while I said it, ready to catch him if the words knocked him sideways, but he just stood there, small and serious in his little blue jacket, absorbing it the steady way kids absorb things that grown adults spend years bracing themselves against. Then I told him the other part, the part I'd been carefully waiting 3 whole years to give him, the part I believed with everything left in me was actually a gift rather than a wound. I told him he didn't share 1 drop of blood with the man who had hurt his mother. I told him his mom wanted him so badly, so completely, so fiercely, that when life made it hard for her to have him the easy way, she went out on her own and found a way to bring him into this world entirely by herself, because she flatly refused to let anyone or anything stand between her and loving him. "You are the purest thing that woman ever did in her whole life," I told him, kneeling down in the grass in front of her headstone, so I was looking him level in the eye, man to boy. "Nobody ever stained that, not him, not anybody. You hear me clearly?" I watched something shift in my grandson's face that afternoon, something settle and loosen at the same time, like a knot finally coming undone after years of being pulled too tight to breathe around. Kids carry weight they can't even name when the adults around them refuse to give them the truth to hold on to instead. Finn didn't cry that day, not the way I half expected him to. He just nodded, slow and solemn, more grown than any 8-year-old should have to be, and asked if he could pick some of the wildflowers growing wild near the cemetery fence to leave on his mother's grave. I let him. We stood there together for a long while after that, in the quiet, listening to the wind move through the trees, and I have never once regretted telling him the truth straight, without the softening most people around here would have insisted on. That boy has grown up in the 3 years since without 1 ounce of shame hanging over him about who his father was, because he knows now, clearly and completely, that the man sitting in that prison cell was never his father to begin with, not for a single day. He grew up light instead. Instead of carrying a secret he'd have eventually had to uncover on his own, alone, the hard way, the way too many kids in this world are forced to. A few weeks ago, I was out in my garage on a quiet Saturday afternoon, watching Finn chase our neighbor's dog across the backyard through the open door, laughing the wide-open way only an 8-year-old boy laughs when nothing in the world is weighing him down. I walked over to my workbench, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out Sylvie's old mustard-colored suede bag. I'd had it repaired months earlier, the seam stitched back together clean and tight by a leather worker downtown who never once asked me a single question about why a grown man was crying quietly at her counter over an old bag. I turned it over in my hands for a long time that afternoon. That bag had once held the single worst thing I have ever learned about another human being in 31 years of learning ugly things for a living, and now it just sits on a shelf in my garage, closed, whole, repaired, no longer a container for anyone's secrets at all, just an old bag with a good story behind it that I'll tell my grandson in full someday when he's old enough to hear every last detail. I've come to believe something in the years since that night. I chased a dumpster like a much younger man ever had any business doing. Time does not heal wounds, whatever the greeting cards in the drugstore aisle want you to believe. I still wake up some mornings and reach for a phone to call my wife before I remember all over again that she's gone. I still catch myself some evenings about to dial Sylvie's old number just to hear how her day went. Time doesn't touch grief like that. Not really. It just teaches a man to carry it quietly without dropping everything else he's holding at the same time. But the truth does something time never manages to do. The truth closes a door that grief keeps trying its hardest to leave open. The truth took a monster who had been operating in plain sight for over a decade, dressed in expensive suits and charity galas and tearful grieving widower interviews, and put him somewhere he will never hurt another living soul again for as long as he draws breath. The truth gave my grandson a childhood free of a lie that would have eaten away at him quietly from the inside for the rest of his life. The truth let me look my late wife and my daughter in the eye, in the only way I have left to do that anymore, and tell them both honestly without flinching that I finally settled the account in full. Finn came running into the garage a minute later, breathless, cheeks bright red from the cold October air, asking if I wanted to help him build a fort out of the leftover lumber stacked against the back wall. I set that bag back down on its shelf, gently, the way you set down something you've finally, truly made peace with after years of carrying it, And I told him I'd be right there. Give me 1 minute. Because that's the whole point, in the end, of everything I went through to get here. Not the justice, though I'll never once apologize for wanting it with my whole chest. Not the satisfaction of watching a predator's entire, carefully built life collapse in a single afternoon, though I won't pretend that didn't feel good too, in a way I'm not ashamed of. The whole point was that little boy out in my backyard, laughing, unburdened, growing up exactly the way his mother always wanted for him. Safe, loved, and finally, completely free of every single lie that man ever told to keep him. My daughter's legacy isn't a foundation with her name stamped on a brass plaque anymore, the one Rourke built for the cameras and the tax write-off and quietly used to launder his own reputation. Her real legacy is running around my backyard right now with grass-stained knees, learning to ride the bike I bought him last spring, and asking me every single night at dinner if we can please have pancakes for breakfast again tomorrow. That's the only monument that ever mattered to me. That's the only one I intend to spend whatever years I have left standing guard over, no matter what it costs me to do it.